A weasel weighs about as much as a bar of soap. 4 ounces, sometimes less, and it can fit through a gap the width of your thumb. That's not an exaggeration for effect. A least weasel can pour itself through a hole the size of a quarter. Its skull barely has to compress. If a hole exists anywhere in a coop wall, floor seam or roof line, and that hole is bigger than an inch, a weasel considers it an open door. Here's what makes that terrifying instead of just interesting. A fox that gets into a coop kills one bird and drags it off to eat. A weasel doesn't stop at one. It kills everything that moves, sometimes 20 or 30 birds in a single night, and eats almost none of it. Farmers call it a massacre. Biologists call it surplus killing, and nobody fully agrees on why it happens. Some think it's an ancient instinct, built for a world where a weasel might not eat again for days, so when prey is trapped and can't escape, it kills on reflex until the killing stops itself. Amish farms lose whole coops to this animal more than almost any other predator, and the reason comes down to how these families build. No electricity means no electric fence, no motion light, no automatic coop door that locks itself at dusk. Everything that keeps a weasel out has to be built by hand and built right the first time, because there's no sensor to catch what a nail gun missed. So how do you stop something that can get through a gap smaller than your finger? You start by understanding that most predator proofing already fails before the weasel even shows up. Standard chicken wire, the hexagonal kind sold cheap at almost every farm store, is built to keep chickens in. It was never built to keep anything out. The gaps run close to an inch, sometimes wider once the wire's been stretched a season or two, and a weasel walks through it like a doorway. An Amish farmer named Eli, who raises layers on a 40-acre spread in Holmes County, Ohio, learned that the hard way in his first year. He lost 11 hens in one night to something he never even saw. Just feathers, blood on the straw, and a coop gone silent by morning. Picture the scene his son found at chore time. Dawn, cold enough that breath hung in the air, and the coop that should have been loud with clucking was dead quiet. 11 birds down. 2 more wandering in shock, feathers gone from their necks but somehow still alive. Nothing eaten, nothing dragged off, just carnage and no visible way in. It took Eli 2 full days of walking the coop before he found it. A gap where the roofline met the wall on the north side, barely wider than a pencil, hidden behind a support beam nobody had checked in 3 years. A weasel had been living in the fence row all summer, hunting mice, and one night it followed a mouse straight through that gap and found 30 birds instead of 1. What replaced the chicken wire on his farm, and on most Amish operations that have been burned once, is 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch hardware cloth. It's heavier, it's stiffer, and the gaps are too small for a weasel's skull to pass through, no matter how far it can flatten its ribs. But hardware cloth alone doesn't solve the problem, because a weasel doesn't need a wall, it needs a seam. The place where the roof meets the wall, the gap under a door that's warped 1/2 inch from a wet spring, the knothole where a board shrank away from its neighbour over a dry summer. Every one of those is a door if you don't close it. That's why the actual work of weasel-proofing an Amish coop isn't a single fix, it's a walk. Farmers here talk about walking the coop, going around the entire structure on hands and knees with a flashlight, running a hand along every seam, every corner, every place 2 materials meet. If a finger fits, a weasel fits. That standard gets repeated on Amish farms almost word for word, generation to generation, because it's the only rule simple enough to actually follow every single time. Eli rebuilt his coop over 2 weeks that spring, working evenings after field work with his 2 oldest sons. They lined the entire structure in 1/2 inch hardware cloth, and where mice had already been getting in near the feed bins, they stepped down to 1/4 inch, because a determined weasel will follow a mouse tunnel straight into a coop it couldn't otherwise breach. That detail matters more than most first-time coop builders realize. Weasels aren't just hunting chickens directly, they're often hunting the mice and rats that a messy coop attracts, and they'll widen or follow an existing rodent path until it opens into the coop itself. Keep the feed sealed, keep the floor swept, and you starve out the rodents that would otherwise build the weasel a highway. The floor got attention too. Eli's original coop sat directly on packed dirt, which meant a weasel that couldn't find a gap in the walls could simply dig one. So the sons buried hardware cloth 2 feet down around the entire perimeter, bent outward into an L shape a family friend had seen work on a neighboring farm. A weasel or fox that tries to dig straight down at the wall hits buried mesh instead of open dirt, and most give up rather than dig sideways to find the edge of it. Doors got the same treatment. On an Amish farm, coop doors are usually solid wood, hung by hand. And the failure point isn't the door itself. It's the gap that opens up underneath once the wood swells and shrinks with the seasons. A 1/4 inch gap under a door doesn't sound like much, until you remember what a weasel can do with a 1/4. Eli's sons nailed a strip of hardware cloth along the base of every door, low enough to drag against the ground, so even a swollen or warped door still closes against wire instead of air. Windows, which on most Amish coops exist purely for airflow since there's no electric fan to move air through a closed building, needed covering that wouldn't choke off ventilation but would still stop a weasel from squeezing through in the middle of the night. 1/2 inch hardware cloth again, stapled tight, checked every few weeks for rust or a corner worked loose by weather. None of this comes cheap either, and that's worth saying plainly. 1/2 inch hardware cloth runs several times the price of ordinary chicken wire, and a family rebuilding an entire coop, floor to roof line, is looking at a real cost against a farm income that often runs thin to begin with. Eli didn't do it all at once. He prioritized the north wall first, where the breach had happened, then worked outward over 2 seasons as the budget allowed, patching the weakest points before moving to the ones that were merely possible. That's a practical order almost any farmer facing the same math would recognize, Amish or not. Fix the door that's already failed before you reinforce the one that hasn't yet. And then there's the part almost nobody talks about outside farm country. Even a coop that's fully sealed can still get hit, because a weasel doesn't only attack at night through a gap. Sometimes it gets shut in during the day, hiding in a nesting box or under a floorboard while the coop was open for cleaning. And it doesn't come out until the birds are locked in with it after dark. Which is why walking the coop isn't a one-time job. It's a habit. Eli checks his seams every week during laying season, because a board that was tight in April can shrink loose by August, and a weasel doesn't wait for convenient timing. A neighboring family, the Millers, learned a version of the same lesson from the opposite direction. Their coop was tight. Hardware cloth, buried apron, everything Eli would recognize. But they kept losing eggs, and eventually a few birds, and couldn't figure out how. Turned out, the entry point wasn't a wall gap at all. It was the vent stack running up through the roof for airflow, capped with wire mesh that had rusted through after 4 winters and never been walked, because nobody thinks to check a pipe on the roof. A weasel found that rusted mesh, chewed the last threads open, and dropped straight down into the rafters. The lesson traveled fast through the community after that. Check the roof vents. Check anything that pierces the structure, not just the walls around it. Part of what makes this predator so hard to plan for is that most farmers can't even agree on what they're dealing with until the damage is already done. A long-tailed weasel, a least weasel, and a mink all leave a similar signature. Small bite marks at the base of the skull or the throat, birds killed in bulk rather than one at a time, almost nothing eaten on sight. The difference matters because a mink is a stronger swimmer and more likely to come from a pond or creek edge, while a least weasel is more likely to be living in a fence row or a stone pile 100 feet from the coop, hunting mice the same way it hunts chickens. Eli's community has learned to read the tracks in fresh snow or soft mud near the coop rather than guess. A weasel's track shows 5 toes close together in a bounding pattern with long gaps between prints. A mink's track runs slightly larger, with webbing sometimes faint in the print if the mud is soft enough to catch it. Getting the identification right changes where you set a trap and how far from water you bother looking. Seasons change the risk too, and this is something almost every Amish farmer in weasel country learns the hard way at least once. Late summer and fall bring the worst of it, when young weasels born that spring disperse from their mother's territory and go looking for ground of their own. A juvenile weasel, inexperienced and hungry, is more likely to take a reckless chance on a gap it hasn't scouted, which is exactly why so many first-time coop breaches happen in September and October rather than the dead of winter. Farmers who've been at this a while start walking their coops more often once the leaves start turning, not less, because that's when a young weasel with no den of its own is most likely to go looking for an easy building to move into. The community response to a bad weasel year looks a lot like the community response to anything else on an Amish farm. Word travels. If one family loses a flock, the neighbors hear about it within days, and within a week, 2 or 3 of them are out checking their own coops with a flashlight on a Saturday evening, comparing notes over the fence about what they found and what they missed. It's the same instinct that drives a barn raising, applied to something far less visible than a barn. Nobody advertises it, nobody writes it down in a manual. It just gets passed along, farm to farm, the way most practical knowledge does in a community that solves its own problems by hand. Even with every gap closed, some farms still get a weasel that's already established a den nearby, hunting the property out of habit rather than opportunity. That's when trapping comes in, and this is where Amish practicality really shows itself. No electricity means no electronic trap, no camera to check remotely. It means a simple live trap or a small steel leg hold set, baited with a scrap of fresh meat, checked by hand every single morning before chores start, usually before the sun is fully up. Some states require live release rather than lethal trapping for certain species, so farmers check local regulations before setting anything. Then release the animal miles from the property, if that's what the law and their own conscience calls for. There's a rhythm to it that outsiders miss. The trap gets set at dusk, near the fence row or the spot where tracks showed up in soft mud. It gets checked before breakfast, every morning, rain or shine, because a trapped animal left too long is its own kind of cruelty. And because leaving a trap unchecked defeats the entire point of setting it. On a farm with no alarm clock but the rooster, and no reminder app but memory, that discipline gets built the same way the coop does, one repeated habit at a time. What's striking, talking to families who've dealt with this for generations, is how little the method has actually changed. The tools are the same tools their grandfathers used: hardware cloth instead of chicken wire, a buried apron instead of a fence post sunk shallow, a door that drags against wire, not dirt. None of it is complicated. All of it requires the kind of patience that comes from doing farm work by hand instead of by app, checking every seam because there's no motion sensor to check it for you. Eli hasn't lost a bird to a weasel since that first spring. Not because weasels stopped showing up, Neighbours still see tracks in the snow along the fence line most winters. But because the Coop stopped offering anywhere for one to get in. The animal that can pour itself through a hole the width of a finger needs exactly one mistake, one seam left unchecked, one gap where a board shrank away from its neighbour. Close every one of those, and the smallest, most efficient killer on the farm has nowhere left to go. That's the whole trick, really, not outsmarting the weasel, just refusing to leave it a door. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a second, because it says something bigger than chicken coops. Eli didn't beat this thing with a gadget or a gun. He beat it by walking the same fence line, on his knees with a flashlight, again and again, until there was nothing left for it to find. Was the work worth it? All those evenings checking seams instead of resting after a full day in the fields? Ask him now, with 11 straight seasons and not one bird lost. And the answer isn't really a question anymore. Some problems don't get solved once. They get solved every single week, for as long as you're willing to keep checking. No app for that. No sensor either, just a flashlight, a set of knees that don't mind the cold ground, and the willingness to look one more time at a wall you already checked last week.